January 27th, 1856. On a cold night in Cincinnati, Ohio, Margaret Garner and her family of 7, 4 of them children, huddled together in the small cabin of a freed relative. Newly escaped from Kentucky, there was a growing fear among them that they would be caught and returned before moving north to Canada. Those fears became realized that night as a band of slave catchers, including their former master, gathered outside the cabin, guns drawn, demanding that all of them surrender or face certain death. Without hesitation, the occupants of the cabin began to fortify the doors and windows with anything they could find to, at the very least, build an obstacle. As they loaded their guns and prepared for the worst, Margaret grabbed a knife, approached her children, and began to systematically cut their throats, starting with her daughter. A gunfight ensued, and after the smoke had cleared and the cabin doors were flung open, Margaret was found stooping in the corner, holding her dead daughter with a defiant smirk. She was relieved, calm, and thankful that from then on, none of her children would ever see a plantation again. The story of Margaret Garner, although horrid, shocked the nation and forced it to reckon with the plain truth that slaves were entitled to the same human rights as any American, along with the depths that any free man or woman would go to escape the horrors of Jim Crow South. 131 years later, Margaret's story was reimagined in book form by an Ohio native, turned editor, turned author, whose birth name was Chloe Wofford. A year later, the book, Beloved, was awarded the Pulitzer Prize for Literature, and 5 years after that, Chloe became the first African-American woman to win the Nobel Prize for Literature. To those who knew her, she would always be Chloe. But to the world, Toni Morrison had cemented her place in history with the power of her beautiful mind. Welcome to the Stories We Tell Ourselves podcast, episode 10. Thank you all for joining us for the 10th episode of the Stories We Tell Ourselves podcast. If you haven't guessed already, today we are going to talk about the prolific writer Toni Morrison. As always, I'd like to go right past the preamble and get straight to the episode. Having that in mind, we're going to begin. Toni Morrison was born Chloe Anthony Wofford on February 18th, 1931, to George and Rama Wofford in the attic of their rented home in Lorain, Ohio. Before her birth, her family had moved from Georgia at the height of racial tensions in order to ensure that their family would progress without the weight of blatant racism as a hindrance. At the time, her father would leave the family to work in various towns throughout the South, but when her mother began to notice that local racists tended to gather and eyeball her young daughters while he was away, she fled, sending him a message that if he ever wanted to see them again, he would need to meet them on the next train smoking. Luckily for them, George did meet them on the way, and they started a new life in Lorain. The neighborhood that they chose to live in, Lorain, was a refuge. It was multicultural, and the girls would be safe and have the freedom to grow without the mental confinement that the South imposed upon its black residents. The family did struggle, often evicted for unpaid rent, which at the time was about $4 a week, but the girls were still encouraged to learn and seek curiosity. Learning to read by the age of 3, Toni was immediately recognized as brilliant, and throughout her childhood and teenage years, she was a voracious reader. She even got a job at the local library thanks to her older sister. After graduating high school, most girls of her age did the traditional thing: marriage, children, and homemaking. But unlike most girls, Toni had the confidence to take a chance on herself, applying and being accepted to Howard University, where she majored in English. Due to her intelligence and good looks, she found herself very popular on campus, even coming second place in the race for homecoming queen. It was at college where she decided to use the shortened version of her middle name, Anthony, after noticing that for some reason, people had a difficult time pronouncing her name when read. Clee, Callow became Toni, and the name would be her moniker from that moment forward. After college, she married and had 2 children while teaching at Cornell and again at Howard. But a few years after her 7-year term ended, she found herself divorced with 2 children and back living with her parents in Lorain, Ohio. A few weeks after returning home, Toni saw an advertisement for a job offering as an editor at a publishing house in Syracuse, New York. After making the journey to Syracuse with her sister, she interviewed and got the job, only to have the company sold to Random House a few months later. Random House buying the company meant that all employees had to move to New York or find another job. Toni moved to New York with her 2 boys and didn't think twice. She quickly gained a reputation as an excellent and attentive editor, but secretly, she began to write her first novel, The Bluest Eye, in her free time. After 5 years, the novel was finished, and her fellow editors were blown away at her writing ability. Shortly after, Random House purchased the book, happy to brag that one of their editors possessed such a masterful ability to write. It was around this time that the protest movement of the 70s began to grow in prominence. Mostly male-centered, Black women began to have their voices moved to the forefront. Toni understood that although she wasn't able to get in the trenches and protest due to her profession as a working editor, she could assist in the magnification of their voices. Immediately, Toni began to sign and edit most of the more prominent voices of the movement, using her extraordinary editing skills to lift the content of their work from mere stories to developed, attention-grabbing masterpieces, even editing Muhammad Ali's first memoir, which went on to be a bestseller. From there, Toni's works began to sell. Sula, Song of Solomon. She even created the Black Book, an archival collection of Black historical media, entertainment, and caricatures from the past 100 or so years. It was at this time that Toni began to wonder if it were possible to maintain her position as one of the best editors in New York, while simultaneously having her reputation grow as one of the best up-and-coming writers in the world. One of them would need to go, and shortly before releasing one of her most well-known works of fiction, Beloved, Toni left Random House to become a full-time writer. Truth be told, before Song of Solomon was released, Toni had a hard time calling herself a writer. It didn't feel earned. Not that she was a hobbyist either, but after time and consideration and a whirlwind of raving reviews, she felt comfortable calling herself just that, a writer, that plain, that simple. Toni carried a philosophy when writing her novels. Up to that time, the majority of minority writers wrote in a way that seemed to seek white validation, subconsciously or not. For instance, a writer would have a passage written about chitterlings and explain the texture, the pig it came from, and the time used to cook them. But Toni realized that if you were of the culture, you could simply say chitlins, and everyone knew what you were talking about. It evoked the smells, the tastes, the textures, without even needing those details. She made the bold choice to have her work be free from the need of the white gaze. If people outside the culture had questions, they should ask, but the content of her stories would not be weighed down with expository sentences and overwritten prose. It was with that mentality that The Bluest Eye was released to much fanfare. Around the same time, there was a movement among Black writers for writers like Toni to get their just due. 48 of the most respected writers at the time banded together to petition some of the award-granting establishments to recognize Toni's work and give her the notoriety that she had earned years prior and still. Some writers viewed this as a contradiction, though. If she was so opposed to the white gaze, why would she even care to seek their awards? But after the public pressure began to swell to the point of obvious racial bias, Toni was awarded the Pulitzer Prize. Years later, while teaching at Princeton, she received a phone call advising her that she would become the first African-American woman to receive the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1993. Of course, as always, there were naysayers who viewed her work as unworthy of such an astonishing accomplishment. But as time went on, and Toni began to write even more great novels and have her book Beloved brought to the screen, their negativity shrank from a loud and obnoxious few to a faraway whisper, drowned out by the sound of ever-increasing cheers. Like all of us, there was adversity in her life. In 2010, at the age of 45, her son Slade, a burgeoning artist himself, died of pancreatic cancer. This occurred as she was finishing up her 2012 release, Home. Like any mother, the death of her child had a profound impact on her, and as she entered into her 80s, she began to make fewer appearances as her health began to decline. She did manage to release one final novel, God Help the Child, in 2015, before finally passing away on August 5th, 2019, at the ripe old age of 88. At the time of her death, Toni left us with a total of 11 novels, 2 short works of fiction, 3 plays, 13 non-fiction works, 1 article, and co-authored 7 children's books with her son Slade. I would like to wrap this section of the episode up in a nice, curvaceous bow, but when it's all said and done, you should read Toni Morrison. She's one of those authors that has a tendency to make you piece things together. She doesn't hand you the story, and I think that most people that enjoy reading or even a good story will enjoy her work the same way everyone else who's ever read her work does. The story of Toni Morrison to me was the story of a woman who had enough confidence to believe herself when the world around her wanted to box her in as maybe a homemaker, or maybe just a wife, or maybe just a teacher. But she knew that something inside of her forced her to believe that she could make a contribution to society that was greater than the expected. Until we return. Thank you for returning. Today's episode is primarily about obstacles and how sometimes to overcome them, we might need to make sacrifices. Sometimes those sacrifices are not what we choose to make, but to overcome the obstacle, they become a necessity. Having said that, today's short story is about obstacles and how one man managed to overcome them in a way that seemed somewhat contradictory. I call this story The Paradox of Paradise. When I lived among the living, I went by the name of Dismas. It was my father's name, and his father before him. My mother told me this once during the dew-laden hours of the morning. She rarely mentioned him, not out of spite or some deep-seated hatred. There was simply no time to speak on such things. She was a laborer, a garum maker, who wore the scent of rotting fish on her skin like frankincense along a temple wall. As a child, I never bothered to ask if she enjoyed the work, or if she found her station in life just or warranted. All I knew was that this was what she did. The alternative was starvation and death, and if the fine line between fulfillment and tragedy was peppered with the entrails of tilapia and sardines, so be it. Years before my birth, she made a decent wage as a weaver, cleaning and preparing wool for fabrics. But shortly after I was born, she cut her finger on the spiked carding comb while separating wool. The cut lingered and became infected and septic, eventually causing her right arm to be amputated at the elbow. Shortly after that, my father, a fisherman by trade, drowned along the banks of the Red Sea while attempting to retrieve his net from the moonlit waters. At least this is what I was told. In my reality, none of that was important. My life could never mirror a reflection I had never seen. Most of my childhood was spent rising with my mother before the orange of the sun penetrated the night and watching her prepare fish carcasses for containment and preservation. This goes without saying, but it is nearly impossible to prepare garum with one hand, particularly when the dominant hand is gone. Before I was old enough to assist her, my mother would set each piece of fish upon her cutting board with her left hand, press the nub of her right elbow along the tail, and press large, jagged cuts into the meat until enough pieces were available for fermentation. This took a considerable amount of time, and when she finally was able to place the pieces of flesh into the stone amphora and seal it for the next 2 to 3 months, half the day would be done. From there, we would shuffle off to the market in time to sell a few servings of the concoction to passers-by or anyone too late to get the prime allotment sold before noon. This daily drudgery kept us poor, and by the time I was old enough to speak, I was taught to cut, contain, and preserve the fish and make the prime time market arrival before any of the other vendors made an appearance. This went on for years, and our reputation grew. Over time, we were able to hire fishermen and salesmen who went far into northern Israel, parts of Syria, and Egypt. Even under Roman occupation and unreasonable taxation, we were able to amass enough wealth to purchase a large plot of land where we built several pillared houses encircled by fig trees and Abali olive gardens. No longer did my mother smell of rotting fish and sweat, and no longer was I subject to whispers about the shame that had befallen my household and forced me to learn woman's work. The God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob had truly smiled upon us, but like all things great and small, time has a way of testing your resolve. It was around this time that a famine began to ravage the land. The waters of the Red Sea began to recede. The bounty of fresh tilapia and mullet grew smaller by the day, and even our prized figs and olives began to wither. We were able to withstand the financial hardship for a few months, but by winter, all of the men and women under our employ had gone. The taxes imposed upon us under Caesar had become too great, and my mother, now aging and brought low by the turn of events, was stricken with a debilitating back condition, which left her sullen and bedridden. Her only relief coming from ginger rubs, which I applied on a nightly basis. During this time, she began to open up to me. She told me stories about my father, how strong he was, and how his bravery and kindness were so admired and respected that no man thought themselves worthy of taking her hand in marriage, and secretly she thought the same. She also told me that as the man of the house, my responsibility was to uphold the family name by any means. At this time I was of marrying age, and I assumed that she meant I was to take a wife and start a family of my own, which was true, but she also meant much more. It was my duty to shield our family from the throes of financial ruin. I always believed that money was a means to purchase land, start businesses, purchase fine clothing, and eat the finest meals. All those around us who gained success in their entrepreneurial endeavors did so. I made sure that she was covered in rare silk and jewels shipped from faraway lands no matter the cost, but my idea of money was anathema to her reality. She believed that money was meant for one thing and one thing only, an obstacle to disaster. It could not prevent it necessarily, but it could certainly be a barrier. To her, not only did money stave off catastrophe, but it could buy time to devise a plan. And after selling the silk and jewels and most of our possessions to maintain some semblance of our former lives, we had none. Most of the families among our elite circle had either fled or found themselves in the same predicament as us, so there was no one to petition for help. And for the first time, she implored me to make the journey to Jerusalem to offer a Passover sacrifice, believing that if it pleased the God of my forefathers, our life would somehow change for the better. This would truly be a sacrifice. The purchase of a sheep, goat, bull, or pigeon for a burnt offering would cost more than we had between us, 2 denarii at least, and there was nothing left to sell. My mind began to race. What could I sell? The only thing of value we had was a feeble gray mule, and if I were to sell it, which I knew was impossible, the journey from Bethsaida to Jerusalem would take at least 4 days by foot, not to mention the uncertainty of traveling alone at night. She assured me that God would provide. And as I lay down for the night, surrounded by the emptiness of our once opulent past, I couldn't help but think that our fate had already been sealed, sealed like the stone pots, which in better times housed the source of our now depleted fortune. The next morning, I awoke to the smell of bread, lentils, and fish. In a former life, this would be a servant's meal, prepared for a hard day of labor, toiling in the fields or shepherding sheep. But now, my mother prepared it for me, careful to parse out enough for the trip to Jerusalem and to sustain herself until I returned. Long had it been since venison and wine touched our lips. In truth, I had taken those days for granted. Now I stood, watching my mother, pained and crippled, cooking and sweating over the heat of a chipped and weather-beaten oven, with shame sweltering through my bones. To myself I thought, why didn't I prepare for these days? Why didn't I assume that calamity could enter into our being as easily as the air we breathe? Before I could delve further into my self-imposed pity, my mother encouraged me to focus on the present and eat. Once finished, she handed me the rations and said a quick traveler's prayer before I gathered the mule for sale. Even now I remember her words. May it be your will, Lord, our God, and the God of our ancestors, that you lead us toward peace, guide our footsteps toward peace, that we are supported in peace, and make us reach our desired destination for life, gladness, and peace. Save us from every enemy and ambush, from robbers and wild beasts, and from all kinds of punishments that rage and come to the world. As tears began to swell and topple down my cheeks, she reached into her broken clay pot, removed 6 denarii, and handed them to me as her lips stretched into a mother's smile. I began to admonish her, but before I could speak, she laughed, saying, "We both know that that mule is as useless as my right arm. Go and be the man your father prayed for." With that, I gathered my rations and gave her the longest embrace that time would allow before fetching our elderly mule. On the road to Jerusalem, riding beneath an unforgiving sun, on a mule too old to refuse the task, I couldn't help but consider the doubt that echoed in my heart. I had heard tales about the virtues of sacrifice and how the miraculous had come to fruition because of it. I never considered if it were true or not. Our fortune never deemed it a necessity. Normally, any sacrifices were doled out to servants in our absence as a customary act and forgotten by daybreak. Never did I think that I would need to apply my own faith to my circumstances. Until that moment, I believed that my will and hard work were the only thing I could trust. Now, alone, with nothing but regret to entertain me for the next 3 to 4 days, I was forced to return to the belief of my forefathers, as dim as it was. But with each step forward, I felt the light within me grow brighter. My worry had turned to trust, my plight to purpose, my fate to faith. The hand of God was upon my life, and all I needed to do was proceed. By the second day, my mule lay dead beneath the terebinth tree, and my rations had dwindled to 2 loaves of bread and a putrid fish head buzzing with the sound of flies and the occasional curious bee. The sun had become a nuisance I couldn't escape until nightfall. It had evolved from a guest I wished would go home to a bully with free reign over the day, and shortly after sunset, the night held its own difficulties. Traveling along the Jordan River had its benefits during the day. There were intermittent respites from the heat, either by water or wind or an occasional fellow traveler reminding me that I was not alone. But at night, the shadows ruled. Trees that provided shelter during the day now creaked and churned in the night air. The sound of slithering reptiles and unfamiliar smells became amplified and sinister. Mosquitoes and rodents became invisible agitators, and due to my life as a fatherless child, I never learned how to build a fire to warm and protect myself. This became painfully obvious by the 3rd night. While sleeping, I was awakened by a bandit who brandished a large dagger pressed against my neck with such force that it pierced my skin. I pleaded with him to spare my life and told him of my intent. But once he spoke, I realized that he was a foreigner, and the only language he understood other than his native tongue was violence. With that, he relieved me of the little food I had, and the 6 denarii given to me by my mother now chimed within his palms in staccato, but he did spare my life. After he departed and the sun began to rise, I couldn't help but wish that I had been killed. I had gone from a wealthy businessman to a peasant, from a peasant to a nomad, and now, under the ever-increasing heat and despair, I became nothing, just a man, alone, without resources, entering Jerusalem with only the sound of my grumbling stomach to announce my arrival. The outskirts of Jerusalem were a fearsome sight to behold. Along the way, one could see the cruelty of Rome in full display. Ostracized lepers and invalids huddled together in small shacks. Motherless children wandered directionless, and every few miles a crucified body decayed in anonymity as a warning to any visitor or resident who dared to doubt the consequence of lawlessness. I had heard stories of the crucified, their crimes, and the disgrace that accompanied such a demise. Most men met this fate due to sedition. Occasionally, a Roman soldier turned deserter found himself attached to the cross as well, but this was a necessary death, reserved for the worst among us, too selfish to submit to the powers that be. Upon entering the city gates, I was struck by the bustle that seemed to be in every direction. Merchants selling their wares, money changers and craftsmen at every corner. Amid all of this were the townspeople, man, women, and child, preoccupied with getting to the temple with a fervency that I had never seen before. To them, this was a treasured tradition, able to rid them of the trials of life. To me, this was a chore, meant to please my superstitious mother while soothing my guilty conscience. Whether I believed in it or not, I was here, and the least I could do was try. I owed that to my mother, let alone the mule that met its end so many miles back. As I approached the temple, I heard whispers of a disturbance that happened moments before I arrived. An argument or altercation inside the temple occurred between the money changers and a prophet rumored to be from Galilee. From what I could gather, he had entered the temple and overturned the tables of the money changers, preventing those among us from exchanging their currency to buy animals for sacrifice. I didn't hear much after that, but by the time I arrived at the temple, the money changers were still in the process of gathering loose coins which were strewn about, while Roman soldiers stood by to maintain order. Behind them, towards the entrance, the priests stood with ashen faces and mouths agape, whispering among each other. I could tell that they were still shaken, but moments later, after the tables had been turned upright and the money had been organized for exchange, things went back to normal. It was then that my purpose for being there regained prominence in my head. But the problem remained. I had no money to purchase even a dove for sacrifice. And even if I did manage to beg my way to purpose, after a full day without food, I didn't have the strength to make the journey home. For a few moments I roamed around the temple aimlessly until I decided to lower my pride and solicit money. Being that this was the week of Passover, I hoped that someone would show mercy on me and spare a few shekels and create enough goodwill that others would do the same. But that never happened. My outstretched hand and open mouth stayed that way for hours until I finally surrendered to the futility of it all. The realization of my failure struck me as odd. I was always taught that God looked upon those who were in need, and that if I searched hard enough, I would see my way to deliverance. It was odd to me that I had come to such a pass merely due to what I could only assume was poor timing. My entire family had fallen victim to the whims of time, even though all we ever did was what we perceived to be persistence. Surely, if my father had cast his net in a different direction, he'd still be alive. If my mother had been more careful in her preparation of the wool, she would still have her arm. And if I had prepared for the worst instead of adorning myself with the fruits of my labor, we would have been braced against the tragedy that had befallen us. For the first time in my life, I sank to the floor beneath me and wept. It was a morning that emerged from the pit of my stomach, coursing through the chambers of my broken heart and out of my famished mouth. Even then, I was completely ignored. The only acknowledgement that I received was from two soldiers who smirked and shook their heads as they walked away from me in disgust. I had no food, no money, and most importantly, I lacked the will it would take to forgive myself for failing. As the evening sacrifices began, my eyes fell behind the table of one of the money changers. Stuck between a large crack beneath his table, 3 denarii shimmered in the firelight. I paused and looked around to see if anyone else, including the money changer, was aware of this. But no one had any idea. Seeing this as an opportunity to complete the task I was given, I began to wail as if some great affliction had racked my body and slowly crept behind the table into the large crack that held my salvation. Once there, I began to pick through the crack and retrieve the coins, careful to keep my eyes on the gathering before me. But as I collected the 3rd and final denarii, the sound of the coins rubbing against one another was heard, and within seconds, my wrist was seized and I was dragged from behind the table and beaten unconscious. Hours later, I was awakened from my cell and brought before the Sanhedrin, where 2 people who I had never seen bore witness to my crime. Normally, my crime would have garnered a fine or a lashing from a Roman centurion, but because it was during Passover and my theft was committed at the temple, causing a disruption that disturbed the proceedings, my punishment needed to be a lesson, a deterrent, and I was sentenced to death by crucifixion. Within hours, I was stripped naked, flogged, and ushered to Golgotha by a jeering crowd and the forceful hands of overzealous soldiers. I do not remember the pain. The confusion and the shock of my circumstance somehow shielded me from that. All I do recall was the sound of hammer against nail, nail against flesh, and the churning of the rope and pulley as my battered body was heaved and hung. To my far left, another man accused and convicted of theft was hoisted before the crowd, screaming and cursing at them ceaselessly. The only thought that crossed my mind was my poor mother, how she had no idea of what had become of me and how would she survive without me. Before I was able to dwell in my thoughts, another man, beaten and naked, with a crown made of thorns pushed into his skull, was brought before us. He carried his own cross and barely made a sound as they nailed him to it. Above his head, at the top of his cross, a sign made of parchment was fastened to it. I didn't understand the meaning of what was inscribed, but it read, "Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews." As they raised him to the center of myself and the other thief, I couldn't help but think of the cruelty of that world, how something so brutal could be the result of such a simple lapse in judgment. But also how even though I had failed my quest, I had become the man my father prayed for. I gave my life in an attempt to bring God's favor to my family. And although at the time I believed that the sacrifice would be some bull or sheep or whatever my 6 denarii would allow, I was now the sacrifice. And if it pleased him, the God of my forefathers would accept the offering. I hope that you all enjoyed this 10th episode of the Stories We Tell Ourselves podcast. Overall, the theme of this episode is the obstacle and the sacrifice that sometimes is needed to overcome that obstacle. Like every time, I just want to thank you all for joining me. I appreciate your continual support and the well wishes. But most importantly, I do hope that these episodes are somehow impacting you in one small way or the next. I think that is the purpose overall. It definitely does help me. As always, as I always say, you can always reach me via email at swtomail@gmail.com That is swtomail@gmail.com. And also, if you feel, I don't know, froggy, go ahead and leave me a review. I would truly, truly appreciate that. As always, until next time, be mindful of the stories that you tell yourself. Thank you.